Sands, Executive Director of Live Faith First. And I'm with GaryScott Thomas, who's a radio personality at KRTY.com, podcast host of the Here's What We Know podcast, and a lot more stuff, including, I just learned recently, an auctioneer. So that's pretty awesome. But he's also a friend of mine. So, Gary, thank you so much for joining us today.
I finally badgered Elliot enough to get me on this podcast because I'll listen to it. What's my only criticism of this podcast ever, Elliot? What's my only criticism?
That there's not enough episodes.
Because I need more. I need more from you because it's one of my must-listens to every week. Every time it comes out. It's not even every week. It's sometime. When it comes out, I'm like, okay. And that goes right in my queue. And I listen to it usually that day or within the next day. So I told him, I said, at some point, I got to get on. And this will be the one episode I won't listen to because I can't listen to myself.
It is. It's bad enough editing my own podcast, having to hear my own voice here. So that's awesome. Well, I'm humbled that you're joining us. I think this is going to be a fun interview. And here's what I'm kind of hoping for, and you and I have discussed this, but you are a master interviewer. You have been doing this for decades. You've interviewed, every country star that has come out over the last 20, 30 plus, 40. I won't put a number on it. So I kind of want it to be a little bit of back and forth interview today. Like, I'm going to ask you some questions and you ask me some questions. And so it won't be the typical, but I'm looking forward to seeing where this goes, where God takes us. But as we get started, tell us a little bit about your life. Where were you brought up? How'd you get where you are today? Tell us just a little bit about yourself.
Well, I like to say I'm from LA. For those of you in the know, that is Lower Alabama. If you're watching the video, you can see I have all this Alabama gear that I never buy, but my mother-in-law has no idea what to get me for Christmas and birthdays, so I get Alabama gear. But I grew up in a very poor household with my brother and my three sisters. But that's a bit of a misnomer because I'm an oops baby. My oldest sister is 18 years older than me. As they like to say, Gary, they weren't even talking to each other when they got pregnant with you. You were a Thanksgiving meal that got out of hand, is what you were. So my nephew, my oldest nephew, is literally 2 years younger than me. He has 5 grandchildren who are my great nieces and nephews, if you're doing the math, right? So I, even though I say I have 5, and my next youngest simply was my brother, was 4 years older than me. And that's, if there's a 4-year age gap, that's almost like being an only child, right? And so for the last few years, it was kind of like being raised as an only child. But I worked, there was no emphasis put on education because where I grew up, you worked in the factory, you worked on a farm, you had your 5 kids, and you died at 54. Which is what my father did. And he was an alcoholic and a drug addict who came home from World War II runt. Things that we should never expect 18-year-olds to do or see because there's a huge impact. I worked on a farm, and I realized that I never want to work that hard, ever. And so with that bit, when I had a chance to get a radio job in my little small town located in a house trailer, paying $1 an hour, I went for it, figuring I'd beat the hordes out. I'm the most worthwhile candidate, only to find out later I was the only applicant. I got the job because nobody else tried for it.
By default, you are the one.
Yeah,
you are.
But the good Lord in His wisdom put me on that path, and I worked, and I enjoyed it, and I loved it, and I'd always been a fan of radio, and I never thought you could do radio for a living. So I went to school. I did really well on the ACT on the English section. So I told myself, well, I'll be an English teacher because I couldn't. Everybody I knew hated their job. I didn't know anybody who loved their job. So I didn't think you could do anything fun for a living. So I did not go to the University of Alabama, couldn't afford it. I went to Troy State University because I went to a college I could pay for. I know, controversial topic right there. But I went there and I was getting ready to get
it. Huh? Especially since I just started paying for college this year.
No. I paid for it because I could. Troy State's very affordable. But I was getting ready to get out of school to get my teaching certificate, and a guy I'd worked with called me up and said, "Hey, Gary, we have this We call them gigs, but job opening. We have a job opening here in Lake Charles, Louisiana from 10 p.m. to 2 a.m. Why don't you come do it? And I'm like, I don't know, Don, I'm getting ready to get my certificate. He goes, let me explain your career choices to you. He goes, you can either sit in a room and talk to a stick, or you can try to teach Shakespeare to 10th graders. I've worked with you and I know how much you enjoy talking to the stick. And again, and I say this, and this is not a criticism of my mother, but education was never important. My mother never sat back and asked me what my grades were, or because her parents didn't either. Her parents were raised in World War One, right? And my father fought in World War II. Education just wasn't high on the priority list. And she's like, well, do what you want. Do what you think will make you happy. Can you always go back to school? And I'm like, yeah, I guess. And she goes, so do what you want. And it freed me up, and I went and did it, and I went and took this job. And I told myself, I'll give myself a year, and then I'll get on with my life. And about 4 months into it, I had the epiphany, and now I think it was God-centered, going, why wouldn't you want to do something fun for your life? And so I did that, and the best thing the good Lord gave me from the moment I got into this business, it was the knowledge that the business did not owe me anything. That when I reached my level of incompetence, then the business would spit me out. But unlike so many people in the entertainment industry, and I include everything in that, I include sports, writing, TV, radio, at no point did I think the industry owed me anything. And luckily, it's been 40 something years now. I think 42 years, right? That I've been able to maintain a presence and a salary, even though I'm in a new stage of my life now, being a business owner. Who knew that was going to happen at this age? But the good Lord is mysterious. And so I came to California. Literally, the way I got this job, I was working in Colorado, and we had all been part of this little small chain. And I was the program director of the Morning Man, and I was number one. I had the top ratings. And then I got called in. We got our ratings back. We were number one. And they said, hey, we need you to come up here at 5 o'clock today. And I'm like thinking, maybe a little bonus. I've never worked for a company that offered bonuses. So you Silicon Valley types who have bonuses, wow. So I'm like, okay, all right. So I get there and they said, we've sold the company. This is your new owners. And the guys looked at me and he goes, Gary, you have too much talent for what we have planned here. We're going to have to let you go.
That's not how that's supposed to go. That's not supposed to go.
And I was supposed to close on my first house the next day. I had to go home and call the people and go, I've just lost my job. And for the longest time, I've told this story before, I thought it was the single worst moment of my life. The good news, I had my first job offer the next day. Somebody called me up and offered me a job, but it was just the worst, most crushing moment. And now I can see it was one of God's biggest mercies, because it was truly the greatest blessing I've ever had in my life. That I would never have left. I would stay there as long as you could, but I wouldn't have come here. And if I wouldn't have come here, I wouldn't have met my wife. I wouldn't have my children. And I don't think my walk with God would be as strong as it is now, because I think God put me right where my faith needed to be strong. You and I have talked about this over before. It's easy to go to the Bible Belt and be a Christian. It's easy, right? Because you're just swimming with the stream. In California, you're swimming a little bit upstream. And I think my wife and I talk about this all the time. I think that's one of the things we're here for. And so again, as you get older and you can look back and see all the puzzle pieces, how they fit, that's something. So that's my story. I just want to flip it around now, because I've never had a chance to get yours to everybody out there who listens to this podcast, because you ask everybody else's stuff like that. But you have a fascinating story. And I've always, because your faith was not, you were brought up in faith, weren't you? Because my mother had a faith, but I fought it all along. But you had a different experience because you were brought up in faith.
Yeah. So I grew up here in the Bay Area. So I'm Livermore, which people don't always claim Livermore is Bay Area. growing up, I'd ask my dad, are we really in the Bay Area? He's like, you were on the outer edges of the Bay Area. So I still claim it, and I claim East Bay. Even though when you claim East Bay, like most people think Oakland, Richmond, Alameda,
Yeah.
maybe even Wanacue, but we're like way out by the Altamont, right? So, but I claim East Bay, claim Bay Area. But yeah, born and raised, dad's a dentist, mom's stay-at-home mom. Interestingly, when I was really young, first 5, 6 years, my parents didn't go to church much. I remember we'd go to Easter, and my grandfather was a pastor, so we'd go to his church for Easter, but really never got involved in a church. And at some point, again, 4, 5, 6 years old, just my mom and I went to church. Mom wanted to go to church, dad did not, and so mom and I went. And I remember walking into the church that I ended up growing up in, and she asked, "Where do you want to sit?" And little, whatever, 5-year-old me wanted to sit in the front row, which I'm sure my mother was like, really? We got to sit in the front row? And we never left. Like, that was it. We were in the front row from there on out. I would lean over and never napping on my mother's lap in the middle of church because Pastor Lewis, God bless his soul, was not, really appealing to the average 4 or 5-year-old. So there was definitely nap times in the middle of service. But all that to say, grew up in faith. I actually remember watching my dad, who also grew up, his dad was a pastor in the church, watch my dad be transformed and meet God in kind of an amazing way and start to see his life really orient back to God. And my parents weren't super young, 25 and 23, 22 when they had me, but you end up realizing you're growing up with your parents. As you look back, you don't realize it as a 10-year-old, but you realize it as a 40-year-old. Like I watched my parents grow up and their journey through life. So anyway, with all that said, grew up in Livermore, good life. And then 8th grade. After 8th grade, mom and dad got an invite, random. A missionary came to town, had a Tuesday. Was introduced to my dad, and he says, "Hey, there's a dental clinic out in Miango, Nigeria. Miango, which nobody on this podcast knows the name of that village. I guarantee you. All right, unless you were with me in Nigeria. But anyway, Miango, and said, "Hey, there's an opening this next summer. Would you want to come out for a month?" And so we went out July 1986. I remember 4th of July in Nigeria does not seem like 4th of July that I grew up with here in the U.S. Other than an American flag and probably hot dogs for lunch that day, there was nothing to indicate that it was 4th of July. But had an amazing time there that month. And it just saw stuff, experienced stuff, got sick as a dog. The last week, I got malaria. And so I ended up having malaria like probably 8 times, something like that, in the 3+ years that I lived in Nigeria, maybe 6 times. So I'll finish that malaria story, but ended up, my parents came home and Nigeria had got a hold of their heart. My dad was not wanting to sell his dental practice. Had a few things. Long story short, he, after 17 years as a dentist, he sold a very lucrative dental practice in order to become a missionary. And that act in and of itself, for me, again, as a 14-year-old, you have no idea what's happening. Mom and dad just say we're moving to Africa. I had a great time for a month. This sounds fun. Let's go. And we did. And yet now when I look back, giving up at 17, most dentists, are always dentists. You go to school to be a dentist, you're a dentist. You don't change careers. You don't do something different. You spend a lot of time going to school for that. So you do that. And God called and my dad said, wow, here we go. Sold his practice. So anyway, high school was there, Nigeria, sophomore, junior, senior year. Speaking of malaria, it literally almost killed me. The last time I had it, 1990. Benefit of being in Africa is Europe is very close. So I went on my senior trip to be in Spain. My mom didn't want to go to Spain. I'm like, Mom, I want to go to Spain. That will be amazing. So we went to Spain. But before we left Nigeria, I was getting malaria. Anyway, you're traveling, and by like the third day of traveling and having malaria, it just knocked me down. It actually was cerebral malaria, which is the one that kills you. So malaria is one of the biggest killers in the world, if untreated. And I was being treated, but because we've been so active and just hadn't had a chance to rest, I ended up literally almost dying, throwing up every hour on the hour for like a day and a half. We're on the Mediterranean. So picture this on the Mediterranean, blue seas out the balcony. I'm literally laying in bed. I cannot get out of bed. My head hurts too bad. I'm aching, fever, chills, throwing up. And I spend like the first 2 days on the Mediterranean doing nothing. All I got was a view from laying down to laying over and throwing up and back again. And that was my entire view of the Mediterranean for like 2 days. So anyway, all that to say, ended up going to college, got a career answering phones at a utility company at PG&E.
Where'd you go to college?
And went to Westmont College. So Westmont down in Santa Barbara. I was I think, 8th person in my family. Our daughter just went there. She's now the 11th person in our family to go to Westmont. It ended up being a family school, but not by force. We were not required to go there, but it's been a great place. So yeah, I went to Westmont. But just speaking of low points, and I'll sit on this for just 1 second, and how God just transforms us. I was, mid-20s, doing my own thing. Never left God, but definitely was not walking in a way that honored Him, a way that was close to Him. And yeah, a bunch of circumstances. Been in a relationship for 8 years, got engaged, that went sideways, and I remember just like, God, what are you doing? Like, this was it. Like, this was my future. This was my plan. I was getting my MBA. I'm doing all these things, getting prepared to have a career, and then this just drops out. And I remember that low moment. You talk about losing your job, right? That low moment, saying, God, what are you doing? What is this? Out of that, though, so many things. I began to get restored back to God, began to return back to church, began to get a relationship with Him. Ended up meeting my wife at PG&E. So that was an amazing thing. Finished my MBA, got into tech, and then in the middle of that, God put on my heart that I need to work somewhere, and I would call it hip hop. So so I did about that for 2 years. I've been a pastor for 17 years. Married, daughter, I have a couple of older kids. My wife got a head start on me. So 42, almost 43, 42-year-old. I got 3 grandkids. They're 22 twins and a 12-year-old grandson. So and then our 33-year-old son. So anyway, all that to say, that's a long-winded answer to, it's a bit of that's kind of my story. How
I think it's fascinating because it's so, it's shocking to hear that your grandchildren are the age of my kids. I always tell everybody, this is the face of optimism. When people find out, I was playing golf the other day with these 2 guys who are like almost 80. And they're like, oh, and I said, well, I got to get out of here. I can only play till 2:30. He goes, why? I said, well, I got to go pick up my kids. He goes, your grandkids? I said, no, my kids. And he goes, well, high school? I'm like, no, 6th and 8th grade. And you can just see their face going, what? But I mean, first of all, I didn't know you could recapture malaria. I thought you would have built up some sort of immunity. Who knew? I had no idea. I love days when I learn something. I learned something today.
It is, in fact, it's one that stays in your system forever. And if you get run down enough, it actually can reoccur without getting bit by a mosquito. So malaria is one that it's a gift that just keeps on giving. And so I'm grateful. I think I might have had it one more time, early 90s. But I'm grateful that, since then I have not had a recurrence. But yeah, no, it's not something your body gets immune to.
I had no idea. That shocks me. And when you were talking about sitting on the front row, it made me sit back and think, isn't it funny how you find your place at church? Even though there's no assigned seating, we have our section at our church that, you almost feel kind of offended when you go and it's about a 4-row section, right? So anywhere in those 4 rows that's where we sit. And when you get there on one of those weird days where it's filled up, there's part of you that's not Christian-like, that you just want to go up and go, how dare you sit in my seats?
But you got to move. I mean, I'm going to be real friendly as I say it, but these are my seats. These are my seats. Never mind that I'm 5 minutes late to service. These are my seats.
Yeah, I'm always like, oh man, and my wife will get that look on her like, oh, we missed our seats. And I'm like, and I always want to go to other people. I want to go, look at all these other seats. And then it hit me. I turned away to my wife and I said, look at all these other seats we could sit in.
Uh, so true. It's funny. We're attending a new church now, and we don't have our established seats yet. So it's actually kind of weird. When we walk in, we don't know where to go. Every week, it's like choose your own adventure. Are we going to the left? Are we going to the right? Are we going close to the front? Are we going all the way to the back? So we will get established, but we're not quite.
See, I don't want to confuse the pastor. I think he looks for me. That's not true,
Right.
by the way. I've never given a sermon, and you probably have, and I probably never will give a sermon, but it's interesting to be able to ask this. I mean, do you actually see people when you're on stage? Or, it's like, now I've done intros, I did intro for Tim McGraw at Oakland Alameda. So, there's 60,000 people, right? So I didn't see individual faces, but I was only up there for a minute. Do you see individual faces, and how does your brain recognize that when you're trying to give a sermon?
Yeah, no, you do. You do. You definitely recognize faces. You recognize when people get up in the middle of the service. That's always the odd one. Sometimes it always feels like you just said something somewhat controversial, and then somebody inevitably has to get up and go to the bathroom, or a baby's crying and they got to go, and you're like, what did I say? Is it something I did? And but no, you do. You see faces, and for the most part, you're in the zone, right? You got your message. You kind of know point to point where you're going, and so you try not to let it distract you. Obviously, if it's somebody you haven't seen for a while, you'd be a little bit more like, "Oh my goodness, what are you doing here
But you
today?"
can't react, right? I mean, you can't go, "Hey,"
Right. But it's all in your head, exactly, and you gotta avoid that section after that, because sometimes, or there's been times where it's very emotional, so I can't look at my wife, right? And you're just like, oh, if I look at my wife right now, I'm gonna be breaking down crying. So
yeah, I cry like a baby.
yeah,
And the other thing, because I've always want to ask somebody who gives a sermon on those churches, like our church has three services. What's harder to give, the first, second, or third sermon?
So the last one, you've usually figured it all out. So you've gotten to the point where you're like, I made that either I should have said it differently the first time or the second time, or you've got your rhythm. But by the third one, you're exhausted. I mean, honestly, they say, and I don't, I haven't seen the article, but that you actually expend as much energy as a jet fighter pilot when you preach for 35 minutes. Like the amount of energy, because you're focused, you have emotions. I mean, all the things that are involved. So pastors who are doing 2, 3, 4, that's even one, but especially if you're doing 3 or 4, you're going home and taking a nap. Like there's not this like, oh, I'm going to go out and now let's go run a marathon. It's exhausting, but I do think you do better by the third, but you're just more tired by the third. And they all kind of have a life of their own. So
see, because I've always found it fascinating, and that's what I thought. I mean, the first, you're getting the raw, but you're getting the most energy. The second, you're starting to get the fatigue, and the problem with the second is there's the third, right? So when you're trying to do the second, you go, I got to do this again and again. God gives preachers a heart, and all of you people who serve in church services are just amazing. And I say that not to be just, yay, everybody gets a trophy. No, you really are. When you talk about the exhaustion, singers have finally learned, but there was a big time in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, especially in country music, which was where my bailiwick is, of throat problems. because as I told people, tell you what, three nights a week, 3 out of the 4 nights, or sometimes 4 nights a week, why don't you stand in front of your mirror and sing for an hour and a half as hard and loud as you can? So do that just for 4 nights a week and see how you feel. See how you're doing by the third night, right? Because it is exhausting. That's why, they've started this, especially that everybody, Tim McGraw got fit, and everybody goes, oh, so you can wear a white T-shirt on stage, which, by the way, it is. But the other side is it's so exhausting. That's why they turned to drugs. That's why Elvis had to have the uppers to get the downs, because you're so exhausted. You cannot you cannot exist. And they would do it with chemicals until they figured out, oh, you could just be in better shape. And that works out for so many other people, you know. And my father-in-law, they had a pastor in Florida when they lived there who was all into CrossFit. And my father-in-law said he did an entire sermon. He did 3 sermons while running on a treadmill. He did 3 sermons while running on a treadmill because he was talking about God's stamina or something. He had tied it in. And I said, yeah, Steve, he was one of the gold star. And he's like, what? I said, you'd only do that when you go, attaboy, look at that guy. And I said, so you could tell this story, right? But I mean, I don't know. I don't know his heart, but I'm just saying still. And I'm like, that's crazy.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you say that, because I've always thought concerts can be a little bit short. Like, for me, like, okay, I just spent somewhere between, and my wife and I love going to shows. I mean, we got concert posters behind us. I got concert posters from this last summer here. If I had more wall space, I'd have more concert posters up. With that said, hour and a half. You're like, dude, you can't go longer than an hour and a half. Like, that's it. That's what you're giving us. Maybe an hour 45, but very rarely, unless you're the Grateful Dead or the Allman Brothers or one of these,
And let's be clear, they were
bands.
jam bands, so it included, you're talking an hour, 2 hours, but 20 minutes of that was drum solos.
Right. Yes. And everybody else is backstage. And that's another thing that's amazing. How is it the drummers get away with the drum solos and they don't get the break? Like, is it easier to drum? It actually seems more difficult for me, energy wise, to be back there drumming. And yet they're often the one who never leaves stage. They're the one who kind of keeps it going, and maybe you get the guitarist to do a little acoustic set.
Well, the stamina, I think they build up a stamina. It's hard when you get the singer who's a drummer, a la Phil Collins, right? And so, Steve Perry started off in Journey as their drummer, right? But you pull them out because that's what you would do, and the drummers just drum, and they get to sit down. They're the only people who get to sit down the entire time. Right? It's like hockey goalies or soccer goalies. Everybody else gets to come out, but not those guys, or girls. They stay out there the entire time. But yeah, drummers. I'm fascinated. I'll go. Here's my YouTube deep dive. I'll start watching Neil Peart from Rush on drums, and it'll always start or end with Tom Sawyer. And I don't know how if I played that one song, I'd say, good night, we're done, because I got nothing left. But yeah, and can you imagine? And when I grew up in the Assembly of God Church, and in South Alabama. And I may offend some people, but this is the way our church was. Our church was, if you weren't in our building, you were going to hell. It didn't matter if you were going to another Assembly of God church, much less a Baptist church, Lutheran church, Catholic church, Mormon. If you weren't in our building, you were going to hell. It was fire and brimstone. I'm talking about the first time I went to a church with a friend of mine when I was in college, and I went and the pastor talked and did not scream. I was shocked. I had no idea that you could do that. I had no idea that a pastor could actually talk, because I'm used to seeing spit fly out of the mouth, right? And jumping up and down and turning red-faced and stuff like that. By the way, great theater. But it was different. And it started, I've always been Christ-centered. I fell away from the faith too, as far as just walked on a path, and God in his infinite patience, has just slowly reeled me back. And as I tell my kids, I used to get to be the most selfish person in the world. First thing I woke up was me, and the last thing before I went to bed was me. And at this point in my life, I'm probably fifth, sixth, or seventh on the list, depending on the day. But I always remind them this: hey, dudes, the farther down the list I get, the happier I get. I need you to hear that. And I think that's what God has always said to me. It's like, Gary, make this. I had this conversation with a young man last night. Very, very interesting man. He's going through. He's rediscovering his faith. He's going through all this. He's going through some trials and tribulations and stuff like that, and nothing major, but just those questions that we all have in our 20s. And I said, I tell you the hardest thing to do, and this is my advice. I pray every day that I see God for who he is and not for who I think he should be. And I was reading this morning about David and Bathsheba. And if you look at it from our standpoint, it's a disappointing passage. I mean, for all everything that the commentary, he basically raped her. He had the soldiers go collect her, right? And then killed her husband. And then when he's called on it, he goes, "Oh, I'm sorry," and everything's forgiven. Yeah, I'm gonna kill your firstborn. What'd that kid do? What did that kid do? You know, the next born's going to be Solomon. It's going to be okay. And it's so hard because you want to see God through your eyes is what's right. And it's very hard to sit back and go, no, God, show me who you are, who you are. You know?
And it's an interesting story that you bring up because so many of those types of stories that we point to around God's grace, Old Testament, Jewish scriptures or New Testament, Christian scriptures, when we see those stories, there's a piece of us that wants justice for Bathsheba, that wants justice for how could that child be, how could God kill that firstborn who did nothing? How could, how could you let David get away with murder?
And by the way, when the child died, after he died, David's like, oh, okay, I'm good. Right? Because he's like, he's wailing and he won't eat and and then the child died and he goes, all right, give me some food. And they're like, what's going on? He goes, well, child's dead. I did what I had to do.
But if we were to put ourselves in David's shoes, we wouldn't want the justice that we want for David. In other words, we would want God to treat us with the grace that God showed David, to give him another son, to still keep him on his throne and in his position, to, all of those pieces. We want that. That's the kind of grace that we look for. And I think that's challenging as we cross divides because it's really easy for us to go, oh, that person did something wrong. We need justice there. We need justice there. And justice is good. I'm not suggesting justice is not something we shouldn't strive for. But there's a type of justice that is punishment. There's a type of justice that I got to get my pound of flesh. And the justice that God gives, it looks so different. And you will listen to a few podcasts back where it's actually righteousness and justice connected. Mm-hmm. Well, if we actually connect that righteousness, that goodness of God with the justice of God, it changes how the outcome of that justice looks, right? So I love the story about David because really what justice and righteousness looks like is what happened to David. But if it were you and me who were David and we were the ones punishing David, we would just focus on the justice side of it and be like, okay, we're getting our pound of flesh, and not the realization that there's a bigger story. There's something else going on that I'm not aware of, but God is. And so when you say every day I want to understand who God is a little bit more, not how I want to perceive him, but how he really is, which this side of glory we're never going to get. But with that said, those are the stories that you read and you go, okay, I think God's a little different than the God that I would have. In other words, the way that I would want God to act.
See, I find that fascinating. And I had, believe it or not, I had this conversation with a friend of mine and my son. My youngest son has very deep faith, and I was talking about. I said, the Old Testament's like it's kind of rough to read. It's kind of hard to read sometimes. The people in the Old Testament. And my friend said this, but my son said this. They weren't tied together. These are two different conversations. He goes, Dad, have you ever thought those were the best people he had to work with? That Moses was the best he had to work with, and Moses was a murderer. And you're like, and I'm like, yeah. And I brought it up to him. I said, this was before the Holy Spirit lived within us. And he goes, we had a turn, we had a chance, but each of us were going, and I'm like, yeah. And that's the stuff that I try to remember when I read those passages. The Holy Spirit didn't dwell in David. Holy Spirit didn't dwell in Moses. Those were something that came much, much later. And having that, but again, trying to see God as God is, not who you want him to be. Guys, if you ever get a chance to go to breakfast with Elliot and me, you should. This is what we do.
We wander around. The conversation wanders around.
There's no rhyme or reason. It just kind of goes left, right, and I never heard the whole Conga story. Nigeria, right?
Yeah.
Nigeria.
Yeah.
I never heard the whole Nigeria story. And then there's the next side of it that I know we don't have a lot of time left, but I do want to hit this. You have a great tie to Israel.
Yes. So again, another blessing in life. God's given me the blessing of being able to travel, and it's kind of been in different seasons. I will tell you about Israel, but my daughter right now is in a class at Westmont around how do we reach people with good news of Jesus, and so they asked, well, so where have you traveled? So it's about international, kind of that international aspect. And there's a lot of kids who are like, oh, they go on a mission trip to Tijuana, which is great, do that, or we went here. And our poor daughter, we've done vacations over the years, and they are all in developing countries and connected with Go Teams. So she stayed at some fine places, but they're in Nicaragua, they're in Cuba, they're in Bolivia. And so anyway, so she goes and they say, well, where have you traveled? And she's like, well, I've been to Indonesia, I've been to Bolivia, I've been to Cuba, I've been to Nicaragua, and it was like, the kids are like, how have you been on these trips before? And she's like, well, my dad was a missions pastor. That's just, I got to tag along with him and do some fun stuff. So anyway, all that to say, one of my favorite, and one of my favorite trips is living in Israel. I got to live in Israel in college. I did a semester there. And when I came back from Nigeria, it's an interesting thing. And I think there's a lot of people out there who can relate to this. Maybe not exactly. But if you've grown up and you're not white middle class, there's a part of you that feels like you're an outsider. There's a part of you that feels like the ones that are in are the ones in the white middle class, and the ones that are out are kind of every other shade and every other, socioeconomic. Maybe not upper class, but definitely if you're in lower middle or below, right? When I came back from Nigeria, I didn't feel like I belonged. Here was 3 years living in Nigeria, living in Africa, experiencing that, seeing poverty, seeing amazing things, experiencing life, and it just changes you. So I come back to the U.S. and I look like I should fit in, as far as that goes, right? I mean, as far as my language, I don't have an accent. I look like I'm from here. I wear clothes that looks like they're from the U.S. All of those things, and there was a huge piece of me that just I did not connect. Now, interestingly, when I dropped my daughter off at college here in August, I met a Nigerian student at Westmont, and didn't know him before. And it was this amazing moment of he gets up to talk about this club that he started. It's called the African Club there on campus. He's like, well, I lived in Nigeria, and my high school was first grade through 12th grade. And as soon as he said that, I'm like, he went to Hillcrest, which is where I went. And so after he was done, I went up and talked to him, and like, amazing kindred spirit, where we just connected. So this last month in December, I'm going to pick up our daughter from college. I told her I've been driving 4.5 hours. I'm like, I just need to do a quick walk. She's like, well, you went to college here, so you know where to go. Get out of here. So I'm like, okay, I guess you're not walking with me. So I walk. There's David. Like literally, our paths cross, and so he and I ended up talking another 20, 30 minutes. And what was amazing in that moment, in that 20 or 30 minutes, is as he's a sophomore. As a sophomore, what he's experiencing as a grew up in Nigeria, living at Westmont College, is the identical experience that I had as a sophomore, lived in Nigeria, living at Westmont School there. And I mean, literally, there are moments where I'm about to start crying. There's moments where I'm looking at him and he's about to start crying, because it's just that we were both in it. I was in a pit at the time. He is in a pit at this time. Right? He's like, I'm not myself. And that was the thing, is I wasn't myself. And I didn't know who I was anymore. My sense of humor didn't work. Like, I could bust out in a Nigerian accent in Nigeria. My friends would be on the floor laughing. Like, we would just, we would have a great time with it. You do that here, nobody gets it. So all that to say, when I went to Israel, it was the beginning of my junior year, and that was the moment that God just like brought me back. Like there was this experience of, here's who you are, here's how you interact with people, here's kind of, and there was this breakthrough moment for me over about a 3-month period, and it happened in Israel. And doing that in Israel was also getting to learn the Bible, getting to see the location, getting to understand the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, getting to understand what it's like to be surrounded by your enemies in Israel, getting to be where Jesus walked, getting to be where Abraham walked, getting to be where David walked, right? Like literally where David and Bathsheba happened, you walk there. And you see the palace and all of those things. And so Israel has a special part in my heart. One, because it was almost a restoration, that place where God restored, for that moment, my faith, for that moment, my personality, who I was. There was just a ton more security in me and comfort in who I was. But then also just getting to like live in Jerusalem. Like literally one day, a bomb went off in the meat market. I lived 3 minutes from the old city. Like you could walk from my school to the old wall in 3 minutes. So we hear this on the radio. That's how you heard things. There was no internet, right? So heard it on the radio, and we decided to go down and check out what was going on with this bomb went off. So we just walked over there, and we watched this interaction between the Israeli military and the Palestinians, the patience they had with one another. And we hung out for probably an hour, hour and a half, just in the mix, just there, being part of the whole milieu of things. And then they kind of opened up the pathway that walked by where the bomb went off in the meat market. And so we're like, yeah, let's walk down there. So we start walking down this kind of probably 15 feet wide or so, but it's totally covered, stone paths. And we're kind of hanging out there, and this big soldier walks up to the three of us, and he's got, I don't know, grenade launcher, tear gas launcher, I don't know what, but the barrel was about this big. He points it in my chest and just says, go. And it was at that moment that the three of us were like, yeah, this seems like a good time to wrap this up. Let's get on out of here now. And so we walked back to the school. But all that to say, adventures, amazing stuff. But the big piece for me was that God just gave me that opportunity to kind of restore who I am, that become like comfortable in my own skin again, which I hadn't experienced probably 2+ years ago. So Israel, for a lot of reasons, has a super special place in my
Well,
heart.
we need to do this again, because a couple of topics that we haven't even gotten around to yet. I would love to get your take on Israel and Palestine, and not to be controversial, just simply because you have something I don't. And I've talked to people. I've got a friend of mine who's works in government, and they have an interesting take on Israel-Palestine, right? Because they work with both sides. And I would love to explore that without getting into too much of the diatribe, because that's faith first, right? We're trying to find what we can agree on. That's what I love about your podcast. And the other thing we haven't talked about is I grew up in South Alabama in the 60s and 70s.
Yes. No, you're taking the words out of my mouth. I was hoping we would get to hit that a little bit and what that experience was like, and even when you go back to the South now, what it looks like today. So yes, we definitely need to do this. But I got to end this with a question for you. What's exciting? All right, what's coming up in your life? What's happening in your family? What's going on right now that's just exciting you and charges you?
And I listen to your podcast all the time, and so many people have such great answers. And I've thought about this. I'm like, what would I say? What is it I'm excited about? But the truth of it is, I'm one of those despicable people who kind of wake up every day excited about what the day's going to bring. I'm excited about, and I haven't always been there, but the last 5 or 6 years and stuff like that, I think God has just restored such joy to my life. And it's not say I don't have problems. Don't say I don't have worries, stresses. I do. And it's an easy job to go, I'm just trusting God with everything. You can say that all the time. Doing it, you can say you're going to run a 4-minute mile. Try it. And it's I think the most joy I get right now. I mean, I obviously love what I do, but I don't know if you could have more joy than I do with my family. That's my excitement. That's my joy. I've got an 8th grader getting ready to go into high school. My 6th graders, my 11-year-old is getting ready to turn 12. And they're in that sweet spot where they are starting to understand the concept of life. And they're starting to understand the concept of history and having conversations with them about faith, and having these, like I said, I shared that story with you a while ago. What if that's the best he had to work with? And you go, wow, whoa, hold on. So I get such joy from that, and such joy from I lucked out and married the best person in the world. And I always tell everybody, if you ever get a chance to marry my wife, you should. She's amazing. And it's not to say we don't have our own issues and conflicts, because it just doesn't exist. It just doesn't exist. You can't tell me that Mary and Joseph at some point goes, would you just pick up your clothes off the floor? And he's going, why do you constantly have to say it that way? Right? I mean, that it's that you can feel the truth of that. But when you get that person that all you want to do is bring them joy, man, that's something else. And joy may be making dinner. Joy may be folding the clothes. Joy may be filling their car up and they don't know it. But when you can wake up that day and go, what can I do just to bring them joy? That's pretty exciting. And that's where I'm at.
That's pretty good stuff. That's amazing. Well, Gary, thank you so much for joining the podcast. We will have to do this again. I've enjoyed our time here this morning, and I look forward to doing this in the future soon. So everybody, let's go out today and live faith first.